Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Revolution of 1848. First, we'll start off with the foundation, why it happened. Then we'll move on to France, and in later videos we'll tackle other areas in Europe. Now, first off, the Revolution of 1848. The foundation was laid of this event in the previous 30 or so years. Napoleon had fallen from power, and he was imprisoned. At the same time, after his imprisonment and removal from power, there were a lot of political ideas being bounced around, and that was in part due to the ideas being forwarded during the 1700s and early the 1800s. These ideas being that governments should look after its people, there should be a social contract between the people and the government itself, there should be freedom of speech, as well as freedom of religion, and many of these other different ideas that many people in the modern world are more familiar with. These ideas were fairly new, at least at this period of time. So after Napoleon, he had spread many of the ideas of these revolutions, both the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution. He had spread these ideas all over Europe. And so after his rule of power, these ideas formed into something we usually call nationalism, conservatism, liberalism, and then socialism. I discussed these ideas in a previous video, so I'm not going to rehash them here too. But these laid the foundation. Many of these ideas are going to be spread throughout Europe at this time. But what really sparked the point in which the local people, and this is going to range from the poor as well as the middle class, and as well as some of the very wealthy. What happened in 1845 and 1846 was there was a bad harvest. This happens from time to time. Now, a majority of the people in Europe at this time are going to be farmers. But you're also having a growing amount of individuals working in factories in the urban environment. So there's a less amount of people who are reliant on farming, but at the same time, they're going to rely on income coming in. And so both these industries are still very reliant on one another. You need the farmers to produce crops, to, of course, feed whatever country they may be in. With that money, they'll buy industrial goods from these factories. If they get a bad harvest, there's a chance there will not be enough food to go around, but also they're going to be less willing to spend any money from their crops on goods and services in the cities. And so, with the bad harvest of 1845 as well as 1846, that disposable income didn't come about, and therefore many people starved. Many people did not have enough money, and those who did have enough money were spending more money on food, but at the same time they weren't getting that money back because the farmers weren't spending money either. So what this resulted was a lower standard of living in many of the areas throughout Europe. Now, keep in mind, this really didn't affect England as much. England, as I discussed in a previous video, they weren't really of the revolutionary mind at this point. Many of the freedoms that the Europeans were wanting, at least the continental Europeans, they already had. And they had a vast empire throughout the world. And so they could easily get food, they could easily get income by trade throughout the entire world. They were in a pretty good place after the Napoleonic Wars. And so they weren't affected too much. So much of what I'll be discussing will be to do with France, Germany, as well as Austria. With the lower standard of living, this is going to resort to people to protest. They're going to take these ideas of democracies as well as the ideologies of socialism, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, and they're going to protest against the government to provide aid, because there's this idea that the government should help out its people. So This happens throughout all of Europe, and there are going to be revolutions throughout Europe, except for England, of course. So we'll be looking at France, we'll be looking at Germany, Austria, Italy, these other regions. So what I want to start off with first is France, and then we'll move down the line. France, there are going to be revolutions. There are going to be protests. So this is going to be generally called the Third Revolution, and they're going to, and if you keep count, this is basically the third revolution that they've had in quite a short period of time. You had the French Revolution, you also had a revolution shortly after Napoleon, and now you have this one in 1848. Now what happens is the local people start to protest. They want the right to vote, as well as state assistance, meaning the government needs to assist them for their unemployment with their trade. So if they're a farmer, they may want some money to buy the seed or be able to continue to put crops in. If they are an industrialist, they may want some subsidies to be able to do their business, and this goes from business to business. The government at this time, under Louis Philippe, he called on the National Guard, which is the army in France at this time. He called them on to break up this protest up. They fired upon the protesters and killed 40 people. Protesters got angry, with good reason, and they decided to seize some governmental buildings, take property, to encourage Louis Philippe to back off. And the National Guard, the army, does back off. They don't want to blow the situation up into another French Revolution. They're very mindful of this, and they certainly have a problem shooting on their own citizens as well. So what Louis Philippe does is he abdicates, meaning he leaves the office of the monarchy. He's actually going to give the monarchy away to somebody else. But what happens instead is the protesters form a new government, and this new government is going to be called the Second French Republic. This is the same sort of institution that was developed in the First French Revolution, 1789. And so one of the first things that this new government does is abolishes the monarchy completely. So whatever Louis Philippe wants to do with the crown is null and void. He flees France, and that's pretty much the end of his chapter. Now the protesters form a new government, the provisional government, and they have representatives from essentially every single group that you can think of. You have Republicans, you have liberals, you have socialists, you have radical Democrats. So you have pretty much every ideological movement within this government. You have the conservatives, you have the liberals, you have the socialists, you have royalists, people who still believe that the government was right to be in charge. One of the demands of this new government is going to be universal male suffrage, meaning every male is going to have the right to vote. And that's quickly passed through without too much thought about it. So that's one victory there for this new government. There is also a support for unemployment. The two causes for this revolution are passed very quickly right through the government. So first off, every male individual is going to have the right to vote. Now, there were some advocates for women to get the right to vote, but it really didn't come to pass. It was going to take a bit longer, but in a second you'll understand why there was a hiccup. Now, as far as unemployment support, what that meant was that they were going to have public work programs to put people to work where they could earn a wage or loaves of bread to go back home and feed their families. What they also do is they restrict 10-hour days in the city. So if you're in a factory, you can only work 10-hour days. If you work on the farm, in a rural environment, you can work 12-hour days. That may not sound exactly fair. Well, it wasn't, and that's going to be a problem later on. Essentially what happens is the government tends to favor those in an urban environment, the cities. They also raise taxes for these public work projects. So they're going to raise taxes for public work projects like building roads, and then they're going to put the unemployment to work building those roads, and then they're going to pay them either in cash or in food. Not a lot of people like that, especially the rural farmers who were taking a brunt of the taxes, and also they weren't being treated fairly by the government. So when the new election for the National Assembly, essentially the French version of the Congress, comes about in April of 1848, the Conservatives and the Royalists are voted into power. The reason for that is because the farmers are going to elect them, the Conservatives, into power because they saw themselves as being slighted against. They weren't being treated equally. The government was favoring the liberals, the socialists, and the urban masses. So many of the farmers came and voted in the Conservatives. What they did was they ended the unemployment workshops, so unemployment insurance ends, and they're going to send the unemployed into the army, or they're going to be exiled. So that's your choice. You can join the army, they'll pay you, they'll feed you, they'll house you, or you can leave the country. Not a very nice way to look at things, but that's essentially what happened. What resulted, of course, is going to be continued violence. Basically, there is going to be violence between the urban as well as the rural individuals in France, and this is going to call many people to look at this as class warfare. What happens, as Karl Marx points at this, stating that this is one of the reasons, and certainly evidence, that the class warfare will exist. They will tear each other apart, and will potentially bring a socialist or communist society to being. That doesn't happen in France. We'll get to that later. But General Louis Carignac, he is going to be called upon to restore power. So he's going to send the army in to break up the protest. He has no qualms about killing French citizens if they are protesting against the government. And as a result, he kills, with his army, 1,500 individuals, and he sends about 4,000 individuals into exile. So what it looks like is going to be an out-of-control situation where a French Revolution may repeat itself. But in December of 1848, the nephew of Napoleon actually gets elected. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is going to be what he's called, and he's going to be elected to this new government to sort out this mess. He's going to get a lot of support from pretty much every single group. He's going to get support from the Conservatives, the Liberals, the Socialists, and the common French people. Many people are going to remember Napoleon Bonaparte of the 1800s, and they see him as maybe a potential savior of the French government. First thing he does is he dissolves the National Assembly and the government that actually elected him into place, and he's going to be proclaimed as the new emperor. And essentially, that brings an end to the Revolution of 1848. Now we'll continue the saga of France and what happens in a later video, but next we'll be talking about then some of the other revolutions of this time.